Welcome to Christian Renewal Podcast from Cornerstone Scriptures. Tonight's story is called The One Mistake He Could Never Forget. There are moments in life that divide everything into two parts, before and after. Most people experience one, a conversation, a phone call, a decision, a single moment that changes everything. For some people, those moments become memories. For others, they never really end. The phone rang at 11:47 p.m. Michael almost didn't answer it. He was sitting alone in his apartment. The television was on, but he wasn't watching it. It had been a long day, a normal day. At least that's what he thought. When he saw the caller ID, he hesitated. Something felt wrong. Not logical, not explainable, just wrong. He answered anyway. Hello? There was silence. Then a voice, shaking, urgent, afraid, the kind of voice that changes the atmosphere in a room, the kind of voice that makes your heart start beating faster before you even know why. Michael stood up immediately. What happened? As the person spoke, the color drained from his face. His stomach tightened. The room suddenly felt smaller. The air felt heavier. No. The word escaped before he could stop it. No, no, no. He grabbed his keys, rushed for the door, and within seconds, he was gone. The drive felt endless. Red lights, headlights, street signs, everything blurred together. His hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly, his knuckles turned white. One thought repeated itself over and over. This can't be happening. This can't be happening. This can't be happening. But it was. And deep down, Michael already knew something. A truth he wouldn't fully admit for years. If he had made a different choice earlier that day, he might not be driving through the darkness right now. If he had spoken up, if he had shown up, if he had paid attention, if he had done something differently, maybe none of this would have happened. Maybe that word would become his companion. Maybe, for years, the kind of word that sounds harmless, until it begins replaying every moment of your life. The kind of word that keeps you awake at night, the kind of word that turns memory into punishment. Michael arrived at his destination. The parking lot was full. Lights flashed in the distance. People were gathered outside, moving quickly, talking quietly, and the moment he stepped out of the car, he knew. Life would never feel the same again. Years later, he would still remember the smell of the night air, the sound of distant sirens, the feeling in his chest, the exact moment everything changed for everyone else. That night eventually became a memory. For Michael, it never ended. Chapter 2. 5 years later, Michael still thought about that night. Not every day. At least that's what he told himself. But the truth was different. The truth was that almost everything reminded him of it. A certain song, a certain date on the calendar, a particular street, a familiar smell, even silence, especially silence. Because silence gave his mind room to wander, and whenever his mind wandered, it always found its way back. Back to that night, back to that phone call, back to the question that had haunted him for years. What if Michael had become very good at looking normal? Most people would never have guessed what he carried. He had a steady job, he attended church, he laughed at the right moments, he smiled in photographs, he showed up for family gatherings. From the outside, his life looked fine, maybe even successful. But there was another version of Michael, one nobody saw, a version that came alive at night, when the world became quiet, when there were no meetings, no conversations, no distractions, just him and his thoughts. That was when the trial began. Every night, without fail, the evidence was presented, the memories replayed, the accusations returned. You should have known. You should have called. You should have been there. You should have done something. Michael never argued back, because deep down, he agreed. One Saturday morning, he was sitting in church. The pastor was speaking about grace, about forgiveness, about how God removes our sins as far as the east is from the west. People nodded. Some people cried. Others quietly whispered, "Amen." Michael listened. But something inside him remained unmoved, because every time he heard a message about forgiveness, the same thought appeared. That's true for other people, not for me. He hated that thought. But it was there, waiting, every single time, as if his mistake belonged in a different category. A category too serious for mercy, too serious for grace, too serious for forgiveness. The strange thing was, Michael didn't think this way about anyone else. If a friend came to him broken and ashamed, he would comfort them. If someone confessed their failure, he would remind them of God's love. If another person carried regret, he would encourage them to let it go. He believed grace for everyone, except himself, and that contradiction was beginning to wear him down. One evening, after work, Michael stopped at a grocery store. Nothing unusual, just another ordinary day. He grabbed a basket, walked the aisles, picked up a few items. Then he saw something. A man, probably in his late 60s, standing near the coffee section. At first, Michael didn't recognize him. Then he did, and his stomach dropped. The older man had been connected to that night. Not directly, but close enough. Close enough that seeing him instantly reopened a wound Michael had spent years trying to hide. The man smiled, walked over, and greeted him warmly, as if nothing had happened, as if years hadn't passed, as if life had moved forward. Michael forced a smile. They talked for a few minutes. Weather, work, family, ordinary things. Then the older man said something unexpected, something Michael would think about for weeks afterward. He looked at him and said, "You know, you've been carrying something for a very long time." Michael froze. The words landed harder than they should have. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then the man continued, "You can see it in a person's eyes sometimes." Michael laughed nervously, tried to change the subject, tried to move the conversation somewhere safer. But the older man didn't seem interested in safer. Instead, he asked quietly, "Have you ever considered that the person still punishing you might not be God?" The question hit him like a wave. Michael didn't answer, couldn't answer, because suddenly he wasn't standing in a grocery store anymore. He was back there, back on that night, back inside the prison he had built, and for the first time in years, a thought entered his mind, a thought that frightened him. What if the prison door had been open all along? And what if he was the one keeping it closed? Chapter 3. After the conversation in the grocery store, Michael couldn't stop thinking about one sentence. The person still punishing you might not be God. He heard it while driving. He heard it while working. He heard it lying awake at night. The words followed him everywhere, because deep down, he knew there was truth in them, a truth he had spent years avoiding. The problem was, he didn't know how to stop. How do you stop punishing yourself for something that feels unforgivable? How do you let go of something that changed everything? How do you make peace with a version of yourself you no longer respect? Michael didn't have answers. So he did what he had always done. He replayed the evidence again and again and again. Most people thought the hardest part of that night had been the event itself. They were wrong. The hardest part came afterward, the years afterward, because the event lasted a few hours. The trial lasted years. Every day Michael walked into the same courtroom, not a real courtroom, a courtroom inside his mind, and every day the outcome was exactly the same: guilty. The prosecutor was relentless. The prosecutor knew every detail, every weakness, every regret, every missed opportunity, every mistake. The prosecutor never forgot anything. And the prosecutor was Michael. The witness was Michael. The defendant was Michael. The jury was Michael. The judge was Michael. There was no defense attorney, no mercy, no appeal, just accusation, sentence, repeat. Some nights he would lie awake staring at the ceiling, replaying conversations, replaying decisions, replaying moments that could no longer be changed. If only I had called sooner. If only I had paid more attention. If only I had gone there myself. If only. Those two words became chains, because every if only created a different version of history. A version where things turned out better. A version where nobody got hurt. A version where the ending was different. But no matter how many times he replayed it, history never changed. The outcome remained the same, and so did the guilt. One evening, Michael was sorting through an old box in his closet. Photographs, documents, random keepsakes, things he hadn't looked at in years. Then he found it. A picture. His heart immediately sank. For a moment he considered putting it away, pretending he hadn't seen it, but he couldn't. He stared at the photograph, and instantly, he was no longer standing in his bedroom. He was back there again, back before everything happened, back before the phone call, back before the regret, back before the years of self-condemnation. The people in the picture were smiling, laughing, completely unaware of what was coming. Michael felt a familiar ache rise inside him, an ache that had become part of him. And then something unusual happened. For the first time in years, he became angry. Not at anyone else, at himself. He looked at the younger version of himself in the photograph and whispered words he had never spoken aloud. "You should have done better." The room fell silent, and then another thought appeared, quiet, unexpected, almost unsettling. "How long are you going to keep saying that?" Michael froze. The question seemed to come from somewhere deeper than his usual thoughts. How long? 5 years? 10? 20? A lifetime? How much punishment would finally be enough? How much guilt would balance the scales? How much suffering would rewrite the past? The answer came immediately. None. Because no amount of self-punishment could change what happened. No amount of shame could alter history. No amount of regret could create a different ending. Yet Michael kept trying, because punishing himself felt easier than forgiving himself. Forgiving himself felt dangerous, almost wrong, almost disrespectful, as if letting go meant pretending the mistake never happened, as if healing meant forgetting. And Michael wasn't ready for that, at least not yet. But for the first time, A crack had appeared in the courtroom walls. For the first time, the judge wasn't entirely convinced. For the first time, Michael began to wonder whether he had confused guilt with something else, something darker, something heavier, something that had been quietly shaping his identity for years. And in the next few days, he would begin to discover exactly what that something was. Chapter 4, the following Sunday. Michael sat in the third row, the same place he usually sat, close enough to listen, far enough to avoid attention. The pastor was talking about forgiveness again, not because forgiveness was the topic of the day. It just seemed to appear everywhere lately, in sermons, in conversations, in books, in unexpected moments, almost as if something was trying to get his attention. Michael shifted in his seat. Part of him wanted to listen. Part of him wanted to leave. Because forgiveness had become uncomfortable. Not when it was about other people. When it was about him. The pastor told a story about a man who had made terrible decisions. A man who had hurt people. A man who carried deep regret. And yet, God restored him. God redeemed him. God forgave him. People around Michael nodded. Some whispered amen. Others quietly wiped away tears. Michael remained still, because he already knew what the pastor was going to say. He had heard it before. God's grace is greater than your mistakes. God's mercy is available to everyone. No one is beyond redemption. Beautiful words. Comforting words. Words Michael believed for everyone else. After church ended, he stood in the lobby talking to a young man named Daniel. Daniel had recently gone through a difficult season, a failed business, financial struggles, broken relationships, a lot of regret. Daniel shook his head. I keep thinking about everything I messed up. Michael listened. Then he responded immediately, without hesitation, without effort. You can't spend the rest of your life punishing yourself. Daniel looked down. I know, it's just hard. Michael nodded. God's grace is bigger than your mistakes. Daniel smiled. The conversation continued. A few minutes later, they parted ways. And as Michael walked toward the parking lot, he stopped. Because something suddenly felt strange. Very strange. The advice had come so naturally. The compassion had come so naturally. The grace had come so naturally for someone else. Yet he never spoke to himself that way. Not once. Not ever. If another person made a mistake, he offered understanding. If another person carried regret, he offered compassion. If another person felt ashamed, he offered hope. But when it came to himself, the rules changed. Completely. Michael climbed into his car, closed the door, and sat there quietly. A question surfaced. One he didn't want to answer. Why? Why was everyone else worthy of grace except him? He stared through the windshield. The parking lot slowly emptied. Families drove away. Children laughed. People moved on with their day. But Michael remained there, thinking. Because for years, he had told himself a story he had never examined. The story was simple. My mistake was different, worse, bigger, more serious, less forgivable. The problem was, he had never actually tested that belief. He had simply accepted it. The way people accept facts. The sky is blue, water is wet. My mistake is unforgivable. But what if it wasn't a fact? What if it was fear? What if it was shame? What if he had repeated it so many times, it simply felt true? Later that evening, Michael opened his Bible, not looking for answers, just trying to quiet his mind. His eyes landed on a familiar passage, one he had read dozens of times before, maybe hundreds, the story of Peter. Peter who denied Jesus, not once, 3 times. Peter who failed publicly. Peter who carried enormous regret. Peter who wept bitterly. Michael read the passage slowly, then read it again. Something about it felt different this time, because the story didn't end with Peter's failure. It ended with restoration, with grace, with a second chance. Michael stared at the page, and a thought entered his mind, a thought he immediately resisted. If God restored Peter, why do I believe he won't restore me? The question unsettled him, because he didn't have an answer, only silence. And for the first time, Michael began to suspect something. Maybe the problem wasn't that God refused to forgive him. Maybe the problem was that Michael had built his identity around being the man who failed. And if that identity disappeared, he didn't know who he would be without it. That realization frightened him more than the guilt ever had, because guilt had become familiar. Shame had become familiar. The prison had become familiar. Freedom was something else entirely. And Michael wasn't sure he knew how to live there. Chapter 5. 3 weeks after the conversation in the grocery store, Michael found himself sitting across from a man named Thomas. Thomas wasn't a pastor. He wasn't a counselor. He wasn't even someone Michael spoke with regularly. He was simply an older man from church, the kind of person who seemed to notice things, the kind of person who listened more than he talked, the kind of person people trusted without fully understanding why. They were sitting on a wooden bench outside a small coffee shop. Late afternoon, the sun was beginning to set. Cars passed by. People came and went. But Michael barely noticed any of it, because the conversation had become uncomfortable. Very uncomfortable. Thomas had a habit of asking questions. Not the surface questions, the deeper ones, the ones that made hiding difficult. For the last 30 minutes, Michael had talked about work, about stress, about life, about faith, about everything except the thing that actually mattered. Thomas listened patiently, then finally asked, "Can I tell you what I think?" Michael nodded. "I think you're tired." Michael laughed softly. "Most people are." Thomas smiled. "No." He shook his head. "Not that kind of tired." The smile disappeared from Michael's face, because somehow Thomas had found the wound without Michael showing him where it was. Thomas continued, "I think you've been carrying something for so long," he paused, "that you've forgotten what life feels like without it." Neither man spoke. The words settled heavily between them. Michael looked away, toward the street, toward the traffic, toward anything that might help him avoid the conversation. But Thomas wasn't finished. What happened that night? The question landed like a stone. Michael's chest tightened. For a moment, he considered changing the subject, making a joke, giving a vague answer, anything but the truth. Instead, he stared at the ground and quietly said, "I should have done something." Thomas didn't respond. Michael continued, "If I had made a different decision." He stopped, swallowed hard, then tried again. "If I had paid more attention." His voice cracked. "If I had acted sooner." Silence, long silence, the kind that makes people uncomfortable. But Thomas allowed it. Finally he asked, "And what would have happened?" Michael frowned. "What do you mean?" Thomas leaned forward slightly. What would have happened if you had done all those things? Michael answered immediately. It would have been different. Would it? The question surprised him. Thomas wasn't being cruel. He wasn't dismissing the pain, but he wasn't automatically agreeing either. For the first time, someone was challenging the story Michael had repeated for years. Michael shifted uncomfortably. I don't know. Thomas nodded. Exactly. More silence. Then Thomas said something Michael would remember for the rest of his life. You've spent years acting like you're all-powerful. Michael looked up immediately. What? Thomas smiled gently. You talk as though the entire outcome rested on your shoulders. Michael felt defensive. That's not what I'm saying. Isn't it? Thomas asked. You keep describing yourself as if you had complete control over everything. The words hit harder than Michael expected, because part of him knew they were true. For years, he had carried responsibility that might never have belonged to him. Responsibility for every outcome, every consequence, every detail, every possibility. As if he alone could have rewritten history. Thomas leaned back, then asked the question Michael had been avoiding for years. The question that seemed to be following him everywhere. The question he didn't want to answer. If God has forgiven you? Thomas paused. Why are you still punishing yourself? The world seemed to stop. The traffic disappeared. The sounds around them faded. Michael stared at him, speechless, because he had no answer. Not a real one, only emotion, only pain, only years of habit. Thomas waited, patiently. Eventually, Michael spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. I don't know. And for the first time, that answer felt honest, not polished, not spiritual, not impressive, just true. He didn't know. He didn't know why he kept returning to the same prison. He didn't know why he kept reopening the same wound. He didn't know why he believed he deserved a life sentence for a mistake that had already happened. And perhaps, for the first time in years, that uncertainty was progress. Because before healing could begin, the old story had to be questioned. And for the first time, the story was beginning to crack. But what Michael didn't realize yet was that something deeper than guilt had been driving him all along. Something hidden beneath the regret. Something he was about to discover. And once he saw it, he would never look at his shame the same way again. Chapter 6. For days after the conversation with Thomas, Michael couldn't stop thinking about the question. If God has forgiven you, why are you still punishing yourself? It should have been an easy question, but it wasn't. Because every answer he came up with felt incomplete. Part of him wanted to say, because what happened was serious, and it was. Part of him wanted to say, because I deserve it. But even that didn't fully explain it. There was something deeper, something hidden beneath the guilt. Something he hadn't been able to see, not until now. One evening, Michael sat alone on his back porch. The sun was beginning to disappear behind the trees. The neighborhood was quiet. Children were going inside. Lights were turning on in nearby homes. The day was ending. But his mind wasn't. It was replaying the same question again. Why am I still doing this? Why am I still carrying this? Why can't I let it go? And then a memory surfaced. Not from that night, from years before. He was 12 years old, standing in a baseball field. He had dropped an easy catch. His team lost the game. Afterward, he sat alone on the bench, humiliated, convinced he had ruined everything. A coach eventually walked over, sat beside him, and said something he never forgot. You think you're more powerful than you are. At the time, Michael didn't understand it. Now he did, because he had spent most of his life believing he was responsible for outcomes that were never fully his to control. When things went well, he felt relief. When things went badly, he felt responsible. Even when the situation was bigger than him, even when other factors were involved, even when life itself was complicated, Michael had always carried more than his share of responsibility. And that habit had followed him into adulthood, into relationships, into faith, into regret, especially regret. The realization hit him slowly, then all at once. The shame wasn't just about punishment. The shame was giving him something strange, something painful, something he had never noticed before. Control. Michael sat upright. The thought startled him, because suddenly, everything began making sense. As long as he blamed himself completely, the world felt more predictable. As long as everything was his fault, then everything made sense. The alternative was far more uncomfortable. The alternative was accepting that life can be painful, complicated, unpredictable. The alternative was accepting that some things happen despite our best intentions. The alternative was accepting that he was human, not all-powerful, not all-knowing, not capable of controlling every outcome. And strangely, that truth felt harder to accept than guilt. Because guilt created certainty, shame created certainty, painful certainty, but certainty nonetheless. Michael whispered the words aloud. I couldn't control everything. The sentence felt foreign, almost dangerous. For years, he had believed the opposite. For years, he had lived as if the entire burden rested on his shoulders. And now, for the first time, he was beginning to question that belief. A few days later, he met Thomas again. This time, Michael spoke first. I think I figured something out. Thomas smiled. Tell me. Michael looked down, then slowly said, I thought I was holding on to shame because I deserved it. Thomas nodded. And? Michael took a deep breath. I think I was holding on to it because it made me feel like I had control. Neither man spoke for several seconds. Then Thomas smiled again. The kind of smile that appears when someone finally sees something important. There it is. Michael felt a lump form in his throat, because for the first time, he wasn't just examining what happened. He was examining why he refused to let it go. And those were two very different things. Thomas leaned forward. Michael, shame is a strange thing. Michael listened. It often disguises itself as accountability. It tells us we're being responsible. It tells us we're honoring what happened. It tells us we're being humble. Thomas paused, then added quietly, but sometimes it's just fear. Michael swallowed hard. Fear. The word landed heavily, because he knew exactly what Thomas meant if he let go of the shame. What would happen if he stopped punishing himself? What would happen if he finally accepted forgiveness? What would happen? The answer came quietly. Nothing. The sky wouldn't fall. The past wouldn't change. The people involved wouldn't disappear. The mistake wouldn't suddenly become acceptable. But something else would happen. He would have to stop defining himself by his worst moment, and that terrified him. Because if he wasn't the man who failed, who was he? For years, shame had answered that question for him. For years, shame had become part of his identity, part of his story, part of how he understood himself. And now, for the first time, he was standing at the edge of something unfamiliar, something he hadn't felt in years: hope. But before Michael could fully embrace that hope, there was still one thing he had never done, one conversation he had never had, one truth he had never spoken completely out loud. And until he did, the healing could only go so far. The time had finally come to tell the whole story. Chapter 7. For years, Michael had told the story, just not the whole story. He told the parts that were safe, the parts that sounded reasonable, the parts that didn't expose too much. But there were details he always left out, thoughts he never shared, questions he never admitted, feelings he never spoke aloud. And somehow, those unspoken pieces carried the most power, because secrets grow in silence, especially the ones we keep from ourselves. A week after his conversation with Thomas, Michael received a phone call. It was his younger sister. They hadn't spoken much lately. Not because of conflict. Life had simply become busy. The call lasted almost an hour. They talked about family, work, memories, ordinary things. Then, unexpectedly, she mentioned that night, the night. Even after all these years, those two words still tightened something inside him. His sister grew quiet. Then she said something he wasn't prepared to hear. "Can I tell you something?" Michael swallowed. "Sure." There was a long pause. Then she spoke softly. "For years, I thought you blamed yourself." Michael closed his eyes. Because she was right. She continued. "And honestly," another pause, "I never understood why." The words hit him harder than he expected. He stared through the window, speechless, because for years he had assumed everyone saw what he saw: the mistake, the failure, the responsibility, the guilt. But apparently they didn't. Apparently that burden existed mostly inside him. His sister continued, "You were there when everyone needed you." Michael looked down. "You did everything you could." His throat tightened. "No." The word escaped before he could stop it. "No, I didn't." Silence. Then his sister asked a question. A simple question. One he had never answered honestly. "What do you think you should have done?" Michael opened his mouth, then closed it again, because for years he had repeated the accusation without ever examining it. What exactly should he have done? What specifically? What action? What decision? What certainty? For the first time, he realized something. The answer wasn't clear. It never had been. Yet, he had built an entire prison around it. His sister waited. Finally, Michael spoke, and when he did, something changed. For the first time in years, he stopped editing the story, stopped protecting himself, stopped controlling the narrative, stopped hiding. He told her everything: the guilt, the regret, the sleepless nights, the endless replaying, the belief that he had ruined everything, the belief that he deserved to suffer, the belief that if he stopped suffering, it would somehow dishonor what happened. He talked for nearly an hour. Sometimes his voice shook. Sometimes he stopped speaking entirely. Sometimes neither of them said anything. When he finally finished, he felt emotionally exhausted, as if he had been carrying a weight up a mountain. Then came the moment he feared most, the response, the judgment, the confirmation that he was right all along. Instead, his sister cried, not because she was angry, not because she blamed him, because she was heartbroken. Heartbroken that he had carried this alone for so long. Heartbroken that he had been punishing himself all these years. Heartbroken that he had mistaken self-destruction for accountability. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. Michael, he waited. You've been grieving. The sentence caught him completely off guard. Because he had never thought about it that way. He thought he had been paying a debt, serving a sentence, carrying a consequence. But grieving, that felt different. Much different. His sister continued. You lost something too. Michael sat perfectly still. You lost peace. Another pause. You lost joy. Another pause. And somewhere along the way, her voice broke. You lost compassion for yourself. The words landed deeper than anything Thomas had said. Deeper than any sermon, deeper than any book. Because they were true, painfully true. For years, Michael had treated himself in ways he would never treat another human being. He had offered mercy to everyone except himself, patience to everyone except himself, grace to everyone except himself. And suddenly, he saw it, not all at once, but enough to recognize how harsh he had become, enough to recognize how long he had lived under a sentence that God never imposed, enough to recognize that the person he needed to forgive was standing in the mirror. When the call finally ended, Michael sat alone in the darkness. The house was quiet. The room was still, and for the first time in years, he didn't feel accused. He felt sad, deeply sad, but strangely, the sadness felt cleaner than the shame. Lighter somehow, more honest, because shame had always demanded punishment. Grief simply asked to be felt. And that night, for the first time, Michael allowed himself to feel it, not as a criminal, not as a failure, not as a man serving a life sentence, but as a human being who had been carrying pain for far too long. And in that quiet moment, something inside him finally began to soften. Not completely, not yet, but enough for healing to enter the room, enough for grace to find a crack in the wall, enough for the next chapter of his life to begin. Chapter 8. The morning after the phone call with his sister, Michael woke up feeling different, not better, not healed, not suddenly free, just different. The heaviness was still there, but something had shifted. Like a window had been opened in a room that had been closed for years. The air wasn't completely clear yet, but it was moving. For the first time in a long time. Michael wasn't asking what happened. He wasn't replaying the details. He wasn't reviewing the evidence. Instead, he found himself thinking about something his sister had said. You lost compassion for yourself. The sentence stayed with him. Because it was true, and because he had never noticed it before. Over the years, he had become very skilled at self-condemnation, very skilled at self-judgment, very skilled at reminding himself of his failures. But compassion had disappeared a long time ago. A few days later, Michael met Thomas again. They sat on the same bench outside the same coffee shop. For a while, neither man said much. Then Michael finally spoke. I think I've spent years confusing two things. Thomas smiled. Which two things? Michael stared ahead. Guilt and shame. Thomas nodded slowly, as if he had been waiting for Michael to arrive at that realization on his own. Tell me more. Michael took a deep breath. I think guilt showed me that something hurt me. He paused. Or hurt other people. Thomas nodded. And shame? Michael swallowed. Shame convinced me that I was the thing that was wrong. For a moment, neither man spoke. The words hung in the air, because they were true, painfully true. Michael continued. For years, I wasn't carrying the mistake. His voice grew quieter. I was carrying an identity. The sentence surprised even him, because suddenly everything made sense. Guilt had a purpose. Guilt pointed to something. Guilt invited reflection. Guilt could lead to growth. But shame? Shame never led anywhere. Shame only repeated itself. Again and again and again. The mistake happened once. The shame happened every day. The mistake lasted a moment. The shame lasted years. The mistake wounded him. The shame became him. Or at least, that's what he believed. Thomas leaned forward. Do you know the most dangerous thing shame does? Michael shook his head. Thomas answered quietly. It stops you from seeing yourself the way God sees you. Michael looked down, because those words landed directly on the deepest wound. For years, he had viewed himself through the lens of his worst moment. Every success was filtered through it. Every relationship was filtered through it. Every prayer was filtered through it. Everything. One mistake had become the lens through which he interpreted his entire life. And the result was devastating, because no one looks healthy through a broken lens. Thomas continued. You've spent years introducing yourself to yourself as a failure. The words hit hard, very hard, because they were true, not out loud, not in conversation, but internally, every day. Failure, disappointment. The man who should have known better, the man who should have done more, the man who should have fixed it, the man who should have prevented it. Michael had repeated those labels so often, they felt like facts. But what if they weren't facts? What if they were simply wounds? Wounds that never healed because he kept reopening them. That evening, Michael sat alone at home. The house was quiet. The television remained off. The phone sat untouched beside him. For once, he wasn't distracting himself. He was thinking, reflecting, listening, and for the first time in years, he asked a different question. Not, what did I do? Not, what should I have done? Not, why did this happen? Instead, he asked, what would I say to someone else carrying this much shame? The answer came immediately. I would tell them they are more than their worst moment. The words caught him off guard because he believed them, truly believed them, for other people. Then another thought came, quieter, softer, almost like a whisper. If it's true for them, why isn't it true for you? Michael closed his eyes, and suddenly he understood something, not fully, but enough to see the path forward, enough to realize that God had never been asking him to carry shame, enough to realize that healing wasn't pretending the mistake never happened. Healing was refusing to let the mistake become his identity. A tear rolled down his cheek, not because he was broken, but because for the first time in years, he could imagine a future that wasn't built around punishment. A future where his worst moment wasn't the final chapter, a future where grace had the last word. And for the first time, that future felt possible. Not distant, not impossible, possible. And that possibility changed everything. Because once a person begins to believe freedom is possible, the prison starts losing its power. And Michael was closer to freedom than he realized. Chapter 9. For years, Michael believed he knew what God thought about him. Not because God had said it, because shame had said it. And after hearing the same message long enough, he stopped noticing the difference. Shame said, "You're disqualified. You're damaged. You're a disappointment. You're the mistake." And eventually, those voices became so familiar that they sounded like truth. The problem was, they were never God's voice. Not once. A few weeks later, Michael found himself sitting alone in church. The service had ended. Most people had already left. The room was quiet. Sunlight filtered through the stained glass windows. Dust floated through the beams of light. Everything felt still. For a long moment, Michael simply sat there. No prayers, no requests, no words, just silence. And maybe for the first time in years, he wasn't trying to convince God of anything. He wasn't asking for forgiveness. He wasn't begging for mercy. He wasn't making promises. He was simply there, tired, honest, open, the way a person becomes when they finally run out of energy to pretend. His eyes drifted toward the cross at the front of the sanctuary, and a thought entered his mind. A simple thought, one he had somehow missed all these years. If Jesus died for my sins, then why am I still trying to pay for them? The question stopped him cold because suddenly his entire system of self-punishment began to unravel. For years, Michael had been carrying a debt, or at least he thought he was, a debt he believed he owed, a debt he believed he should continue paying. Through guilt, through shame, through regret, through self-condemnation. But what if the debt had already been paid? What if he had spent years trying to repay something that required no payment? The thought was unsettling because it challenged everything. For years, suffering had felt noble. Punishment had felt responsible. Shame had felt justified. But now, he was beginning to wonder whether those things had actually been keeping him from grace, not leading him to it. A memory surfaced. One of Thomas's questions. How much punishment would finally be enough? At the time, Michael didn't have an answer. Now he did. None. Because there is no amount of self-punishment that creates forgiveness. There is no amount of shame that creates healing. There is no amount of regret that changes the past. And suddenly, Michael saw something clearly. God had not been standing on the other side of a locked prison door, waiting, watching, refusing to let him out. The door had never been locked. The door had been open all along. It was Michael who kept returning to the cell, Michael who kept rebuilding the walls, Michael who kept picking up the chains, because the prison felt familiar. And familiar things often feel safer than freedom, even when they're painful, especially when they're painful. A tear slid down his cheek, then another. Not tears of guilt, not tears of shame, something different, relief. The kind of relief that comes when you finally stop fighting a battle that ended years ago. The kind of relief that comes when you discover you've been carrying a weight that was never yours to carry. For a long time, Michael sat quietly. No dramatic moment, no voice from heaven, no lightning bolt, just peace, gentle, steady, unexpected. The kind of peace that doesn't arrive because all your questions are answered. The kind that arrives because you stop demanding answers before you allow yourself to heal. As he sat there, another thought emerged, softly, almost like a whisper. Your worst moment is part of your story, but it is not your name. Michael closed his eyes, and for the first time, he believed it. Not perfectly, not completely, but enough. Enough to begin walking forward. Enough to stop looking backward every day. Enough to believe that God saw more than his failure. Enough to believe that grace was real. Not just for other people, for him. And that realization changed something deep inside him. Because when a person finally believes they are forgiven, they stop living like a prisoner and begin living like someone who has been set free. The prison walls were still visible. The memories were still there. The loss was still real. But the chains were beginning to fall away, one by one, quietly, gently, like leaves releasing their grip in autumn. And for the first time in many years, Michael could see the road ahead, not perfectly, but clearly enough to take the next step. And sometimes, the next step is all grace asks of us. Chapter 10. Michael's story doesn't end here. In some ways, it was only beginning. Because healing rarely happens all at once. It happens in moments, small moments, quiet moments, moments where we choose not to pick up the same chain again, moments where we choose grace over punishment, moments where we stop arguing with forgiveness and finally receive it. Michael still remembered that night. He always would. Some losses leave fingerprints on the soul. Some memories never completely disappear. But something had changed. The memory no longer owned him. The regret no longer defined him. The mistake no longer introduced itself before he did. For years, Michael believed his worst moment deserved the final word. Now he understood something different. The final word belonged to grace. And perhaps that's why you've been listening to this story. Not because you're Michael, but because somewhere in your own life, there may be something you've been carrying. A mistake, a regret, a decision, a season of your life you wish had gone differently. Maybe it's something that happened recently. Maybe it's something that happened years ago. Something you've never fully talked about. Something you've never fully released. Something that still whispers to you in quiet moments. If only I had known. If only I had chosen differently. If only I had acted sooner. If only. The problem with if only is that it keeps us living in a version of life that never happened. A version we cannot change. A version we cannot return to. And while we're busy staring at the closed door behind us, we miss the open door in front of us. Michael spent years doing that. Years looking backward, replaying, rehearsing, punishing, until he finally realized something. The mistake was real. The pain was real. The consequences were real. But the prison wasn't. The prison had been built from shame, and shame had convinced him that freedom was something he needed to earn. But freedom isn't earned. It's received. And maybe that's the invitation for you today. Not to pretend the past didn't happen. Not to minimize what hurts. Not to excuse what was wrong. But to stop allowing one moment to become your identity. You are more than the worst thing you've ever done. You are more than the mistake, more than the regret, more than the failure, more than the chapter you wish you could rewrite. Your story is still being written, and grace still has more to say. So if there's something you've been carrying something you've been dragging behind you for months or years. Maybe today is the day you loosen your grip. Maybe today is the day you stop trying to pay a debt that has already been paid. Maybe today is the day you take one small step out of the prison, not because you're strong enough, but because you were never meant to stay there. Thank you for joining me on this journey. If this story resonated with you, let me know in the comments what part of Michael's story felt familiar, what part spoke to your heart, and if you know someone who has been carrying guilt, shame, or regret for far too long, share this story with them. It might be exactly what they need to hear. And if you're enjoying these stories of faith, healing, and renewal, be sure to subscribe and join us for the next episode, because every story we tell here is really about one thing: the hope that healing is possible. This is Christian Renewal Podcast, where faith meets real life, and where broken stories discover they are not finished yet. Subscribe and stay with the journey.